Ladies and gentlemen, it's really great to see so many people here. We hadn't expected more than about one or two because of all the train problems. So a very warm welcome to you on this rather cold and grisly day. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce Jennifer Taylor, a founder member of the research group for German and Austrian exile studies. And she has published widely on a number of topics, including the press in exile. Tonight, she's going to talk about a publisher whose journal fostered the work of exiled authors and exile studies in Great Britain from the early 1970s and to the present day, basing her remarks on the extensive archive and body of work left behind after his sudden death in 2021. And this is going to be recorded, so if you'd rather not appear on the recording, please do so, and perhaps place yourself elsewhere so that you're not shown. But if you're all happy with that, that's fine. So thank you very much, Jennifer. A very young man.
He was young then, yes. Thank you for the introduction. Those of us involved in German studies rely, I can say unconsciously, on publishers and distributors of books, to the extent that the work of such people often goes unacknowledged. This is a situation which I'm hoping to redress tonight with this preliminary assessment of the contribution of Andreas Mytze to the promotion of exile literature and exile studies. Andreas was born on the 19th of January 1944 in Riesa, northwest of Dresden, and for many years lived and worked in West Berlin. In addition to his book-selling activities, he worked as a journalist and theatre critic. In 1973, he founded the periodical Europäische Ideen. 3 years later, he set up an eponymous publishing company, and in 1978, he began to trade in second-hand books. In the mid-1980s, he moved to London, transferring his business interests there. From this brief outline, it can be said that to describe him as a bookseller is seriously to underestimate the scope of his work. Andreas's interests fall into three main areas: support for dissident GDR politicians and authors, which earned him the accolade of his own Stasi file; critique of totalitarianism and fascism on a worldwide scale. This included the exposure of conspiracies involving, in addition to the GDR, Great Britain, US, and, involving, in addition to the GDR, Great Britain, US, and Israel. And last but not least, exile literature and exile studies. It's the last of these three which I would like to concentrate on today, with special reference to exile in Great Britain, although it must be remarked that there is a philosophical underpinning linking the three topics. Andreas was passionately interested in justice, and this caused him to support those opposing oppression and to attempt to rescue exiled authors from oblivion. Conditions for publishers working in exile were challenging. Print runs were usually short. This contributed to the obscurity of their products. Andreas diligently sought out and assembled a stock of these rare works and provided his customers with lists as an essential service of a second-hand bookseller. Andreas's papers contain many such lists, frequently revised, a task he undertook with Germanic precision, often including for his customers a discrete section on exile. Here should be one example of that. Is it? Yeah, you can't read it, obviously, but it'll give you some idea. Such work familiarized him with the products of exiled publishers and exiled writers, so that some years after moving to London, in 1997, 98, and 2000, he was able to produce 3 catalogues of exile literature. And I'll just show you the jackets. That's the first one, second one, third one. Today, these constitute an essential reference work. And this detailed list of authors, sorry, here we have the detailed list of authors covered in the second catalogue, gives you some idea of the extent of his range. That is a bit more legible, I think. Advertising and distributing books produced by exiled publishers and writers could only go so far to support their work. The very small print runs, which was all that many exiled publishers could afford, contributed to the rarity of the wares and the consequent obscurity of the authors. The foundation of Andreas's own publishing house in 1976 went some way to alleviating the situation. It enabled him to reprint the works of exiled authors and afforded these writers an opportunity to publish new material. The works of exiled writers figured prominently, although not exclusively, in his list, and those exiled in Great Britain were well represented. The focus of this talk is exile in Great Britain, but brief mention must be made of two major projects of the europäische ideen publishing house, two major projects completed in the 70s and early 80s, involving the work of authors associated with exile in the Soviet Union. In the post-war years, the proletarian revolutionary writer Ernst Ottwalt and the anarchist Erich Mühsam, both of whose work was considered anti-communist and anti-Soviet, had been largely overlooked by both East and West. In 1977, no less than 3 titles of Ottwalt's, who had died in a Soviet labor camp in 1943, were republished. And I'll just show you the list of the Ottwalt books again, probably not as legible as we would like. In 1977, no less than 3 titles of Ottwalt's, who died in the Soviet labor camp in 1943, were republished, in addition to a biography from the pen of Andreas himself. A decidedly more ambitious undertaking was the compilation of a collected edition of the works of Erich Mühsam, murdered in the Oranienburg concentration camp in 1934. Mühsam's widow had sought refuge in the Soviet Union, where she had deposited his papers. By 1983, in spite of a dispute over rights, 4 volumes had appeared under the europäische ideen imprint to supplement the inadequate selection of Mühsam's work, which had previously been published in Berlin and Moscow. There were, of course, authors exiled in Great Britain whose work had been similarly neglected. One example is the German Bohemian author Ernst Sommer, who had died in London in 1955. As Sommer's post-war sales in West Germany had been disappointing, in 1979, Andreas republished one of his key works, Revolte der Heiligen, originally published in Mexico in 1944. Set in a Jewish forced labor camp in occupied Poland, this novel was dedicated to the heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto, but had in fact been commenced nearly 3 weeks before that uprising. In this study of the moral imperative of resisting an unjust regime by force if necessary, the protagonists conclude that it is better to die fighting than submit passively to the suffering that is imposed on them. This work was based on information from the Czech and Polish governments in exile in London and the World Jewish Congress. The camp, for example, bears some resemblance to the forced labor camp in Lemberg, which operated from 1942 to 1943, attesting to the author's use of these contacts to obtain information about developments in occupied Europe and the importance of the British capital in the provision of the most up-to-date information to inform and reinforce the moral argument of this work. An altogether more controversial figure than Sommer was the writer and politician Kurt Hiller, leader of the Freiheitsbund Deutscher Sozialisten, leader of one of those splinter socialist groups that seemed to flourish in exile. Hiller had escaped from Prague at the time of Munich. In 1951, Hiller had published a memoir of his experiences with communists entitled Rote Ritter. In this work, Hiller alleges communist manipulation of the lists of the evacuation from the airlift from Czechoslovakia, which had formed part of the Munich Agreement, a tactic, he claimed, to prevent him and his associates from being airlifted to Britain. In a chapter devoted to his subsequent experiences in London, Hiller describes the unsuccessful attempts of the allegedly communist organizers of the Czech Refugee Trust Fund to sideline him. Mytze republished this book in 1980 with the addition of significant historical details in an afterword by Eugen Brehm, himself a member of another socialist fringe group, the Volkssozialistische Bewegung. Brehm had also been exiled in Prague and evacuated from there in the airlift. This afterword gave more details of the machinations in Prague. It included two is correspondence between Hitler and Brehm, written while the book was being drafted, in which Hitler seeks to clarify some of these details with Brehm. As we shall see, reprinting correspondence of historical significance was characteristic of the contents of the journal Europäische Ideen. A further strategy for supporting exiled authors living in England was the publication of poetry, an undertaking unlikely to be financially rewarding. H.T. Adler's Blicke, featuring poems dating from the first 3 years of the author's exile in England, appeared in 1979, and Eugen Brehm's Spätgeburt in 1980. So it's the Brehm one. Brehm's poems had originally been published in ephemeral media, journals and newspapers, which by 1980 no longer existed. This volume, as its author was happy to remark in his introduction, constituted a more durable collection. The opportunity to publish was all the more welcome at a time when lyric poetry was not in demand with publishers. Adler, a concentration camp survivor and refugee not from Hitler but from communist Czechoslovakia, was the chronicler of Theresienstadt and Auschwitz and best known as a social historian. But as this volume of his poems attests, he was also a lyric poet of some distinction, whose skill in navigating between tradition and modernity to develop a characteristically authentic voice was praised by Hermann Broch. While in Theresienstadt, Adler had composed poems which he entrusted to the care of Leo Beck before being transferred to Auschwitz in 1944, poems which Beck had preserved and returned to the author after the war. Understandably, perhaps, Adler had been reluctant to share these poems. A small collection had appeared in an anthology published in Cologne in 1975, but Andreas was permitted to publish a more extensive selection in the journal. 6 in 1978, and a further 9 appeared posthumously in 1989. In 1987, Mytze had proposed publishing a volume containing a wider selection of this cycle of poems, but his choice did not meet with Adler's approval, and the project was never completed. Although this was very much to be regretted, the previous publications of Adler's lyric work was not without impact. Among Andreas's papers is a letter from a correspondent delighted at finding a copy of Blicke in a second-hand bookshop in 2010. Wer sonst als Sie hätte sich damit beschäftigt? The correspondent inquired. Yet sourcing and selling second-hand books and reprinting works which had, in his opinion, undeservedly been overlooked did not wholly satisfy Andreas's intellectual needs and aspirations. As a journalist, he needed a medium which was more flexible than a book, one which could capture the ephemeral, the recollection of eyewitnesses, as in the correspondence included in the edition of Rote Ritter referred to earlier, and a medium which could promote debate. Such a vehicle was provided by the periodical Europäische Ideen, financed, it was rumored in some quarters, by the CIA, and issued at irregular intervals from 1973 and 2020. There was one posthumous issue in 2021. The European ideas referred to in the title were those of the Prague Spring, which Andreas himself had witnessed: freedom of expression, opposition to tyranny, and the exposure of corruption. This periodical reflected the three areas of Andreas's interests already mentioned, including, of course, exile literature and exile studies. So extensive was the material pertaining to exile in Great Britain that in the time available for this talk, only a brief and perforce selective description can be given. Andreas regarded correspondence as a valuable adjunct to the study of literature and as source material for the examination of political philosophy and political activity. And so correspondence figured prominently in Europäische Ideen, the journal. In this respect, two collaborative projects with Charmian Brinson and Marion Mallet, members of this research centre, are of particular interest. The first was the publication in 1987 of an extensive correspondence between Rudolf Olden and his brother Peter, held at University College London and edited by Brinson and Mallet. Rudolf Olden, journalist and lawyer, had acted for the defence in the trials of Hans Litten and Karl von Ossietzky, and as a result had become persona non grata in Nazi Germany and fled to London in 1933. These letters were written between 1935 and 1936, when Rudolf Olden was staying in Oxford as the guest of Gilbert Murray and working on his biography of Hitler, which was published in London in 1936 under the title Hitler the Pawn. This correspondence offers a fascinating insight into the working methods of the biographer and into the historical background and historical framework of the composition of Olden's work. Further correspondence, edited by Brinson and Mallet, appeared in 1998 in an issue entitled Deutsch-Englische Begegnungen. This correspondence, dating from the war years, consisted of letters between Fritz Gross, a bibliophile who'd managed to move most of his library to London, and George Peabody Gooch, editor of the Contemporary Review and expert on modern German history. This material offers insight into the day-to-day difficulties of living the life of an exile, including the education of Gross's son Peter, supported by a grant from Gooch, supported by a grant arranged by Gooch, and details the occasional article Gross was able to contribute to the Contemporary Review. This indeed was an example of German-English encounter and collaboration. Correspondence sourced by Andreas himself reveals the pressure exerted on authors during the publication process. This is clearly illustrated in letters written to Ernst Sommer when he was negotiating the publication of Revolte der Heiligen. Alexander Abush, the Marxist editor of El Libro Libre in Mexico, that's his publisher, suggests several revisions to the novel. The most significant of these are changes to the climax, replacing the original ending, which relied on blind chance, with a more purposeful narrative portraying the Red Army in a positive light. In the original ending, the prisoners and their captors perish indiscriminately in a firestorm created by the Russian bombers tasked with impeding the German war effort by bombing the camp factory, unaware that it was manned by Jewish slave labor. In the revised ending suggested by Abush, the Red Army, informed by partisans, was aware of the circumstances, but arrives too late to prevent the uprising, in which both the Jewish slaves and their German overseers lose their lives. Nevertheless, the Russian Air Force is able to bomb a column of German tanks sent to suppress the uprising. Abish's tone is polite, but it's quite clear that publication depends on this revision taking place. Sommer duly complied, refining the ending by emphasizing that the German victims of the Russian bombs were the same soldiers who'd killed the Jewish insurgents. The revised ending was incorporated into all subsequent editions of the work, and the publication of this correspondence provides the literary historian with valuable information, enabling a comparison between the two disparate endings, so that it was possible to conclude that a British publishing house, that of the Social Democratic publication Einheit, was the first and only publisher of the original version. An excerpt from the novel was published in Stimmen aus Böhmen, an anthology compiled to commemorate the death of German Bohemian poet Rudolf Fuchs in London in 1942. This volume was obviously difficult to obtain, but the publication of the original ending in europäische ideen in 1979, that is in the journal, ensured the provision of a more accessible copy of Sommer's initial formulation. This collection of letters, published in europäische ideen, also includes some from Sommer's West German publisher, outlining the poor sales prospects of his reissued works in the early 50s. The historical novel, it was averred, had gone out of fashion. Andreas, who was a friend of Sommer's family, was aware of the disappointing reception of Sommer's work in West Germany and did what he could to raise the profile of this author he considered was unjustly neglected. In 2007, for example, he republished Die Gaskammer, originally published in London in 1942. This account of murder in a mobile gas chamber in Poland is arguably the earliest literary depiction of the Holocaust. Sadly, a plan to publish 3 further stories by Sommer in the journal was frustrated by Andreas's death. Andreas's interest in and dedication to exile literature was demonstrated shortly after he moved to London. 3 consecutive issues were devoted to German-speaking authors exiled in Great Britain. All were commemorative editions. We have here this one in 1985. They're all out in 1985, in honor of Adler's 75th birthday. Sorry, Adler's 75th birthday, the 100th anniversary of Kurt Hiller's birth. And in the following year, I haven't got an example, in the following year, a special edition commemorating Erich Fried's 65th birthday. The Hiller issue contained a selection of letters written to various correspondents, including, of course, his friend Eugen Brehm, written during Hiller's time in exile in Great Britain. The other 2 issues contain contributions on more disparate topics, including, in the Fried issue, a book review, which is of considerable significance for the historiography of exile in Great Britain. The early 80s was a time when this topic was beginning to attract the interest of academics, but the subject was very much in its infancy. The conference in Aberdeen, which led to the launch of the London Research Group for German Exile Studies, which was in 1995 to become the Research Group for German and Austrian Exile Studies, was not held until 1990. In 1983, a volume entitled Exile in Großbritannien was published by the German Historical Institute in London, and this contained a chapter by John Willett on the arts in exile. In this chapter, Willett deals summarily with the Freie Deutsche Kulturbund, emphasizing its communist affiliations without giving any details of its cultural activities. This deficiency in information about the work of the Kulturbund, as opposed to its political orientation, was remedied in the review of Exile in Großbritannien, which appeared in issue 62 in 1986, written by Freimut Schwarz, a former member of the Kulturbund. Schwarz regrets the extent to which the work of the Kulturbund had been disregarded by Willett, who, he said, dismissed the organization in one sentence, saying merely that it operated predominantly under communist influence. And then Schwarz proceeds to give a brief overview of the range of work of the Kulturbund from first-hand knowledge. With Max Zimmering, he had edited Freie Deutsche Kultur, the literary journal of the Kulturbund, during the war years. It would take many years before a detailed scholarly study of the organization, Politics by Other Means, the Free German League of Culture in London, 1939 to 1945, written by two members of this research centre, Charmian Brinson and Richard Dove, could appear in 2010. Freimut Schwarz, a regular contributor to the journal Europäische Ideen, an author of short stories, essays, and poems, some of which appeared in the Exile press, had been one of the young writers that the Kulturbund had sought to support by giving readings from their work and offering publication opportunities. But although he continued with journalistic work until 1948, Schwarz was unable to make a living as a writer, and so embarked on a career as a photojournalist. In this respect, Schwarz could be described not so much as an unregarded author, but as one who had been prevented from developing as a writer, from developing a writing career in exile. In the words of an obituary written by his friend and editor Klaus Teubert, der Autor Schwarz und sein Torso gebliebenes, eher kleines Werk steht als ein singuläres Beispiel für den nur zu begrenzten Entwicklungsmöglichkeiten im Exil. Nevertheless, in 1993, Andreas published a volume edited by Teubert containing a selection of Schwarz's work, which had been published in exile. Subsequently, shortly after Schwarz's death in January, Andreas assembled a commemorative issue devoted entirely to Schwarz. A classic example of Andreas's journalistic style of assembling material from diverse sources, this issue contained work by Schwarz himself, letters to Schwarz, from correspondence, which included fellow writers such as Max Zimmering, Eugen Brehm, and Erich Fied, and finally, reproductions of several documents from the Kulturbund, including his membership card. He was member 427, thus raising the profile of the Kulturbund at a time when little was known about it. So far, no mention has been made of the interview, a common journalistic practice and a tool which was adopted by academics engaged in recording oral history. Interviews with contemporary authors were often included in issues of europäische Ideen, and in 2020, transcripts of 3 interviews with representatives of the London exile community were published, featuring Freimut Schwarz, the writer Fritz Beer, and the accountant Peter Wayne, formerly known as Hans-Dietrich Wolff. These interviews, conducted by Andreas's associate Nico Rollman, were wide-ranging, covering matters material and intellectual. The journey to Great Britain, conditions in internment, the activities of the Pioneer Corps, the attitude of the host community to refugees, the attitude of the refugees to Germany, the development of German cultural activities in exile, and the decision to stay in Britain. The information which emerges includes such details as the conditions in Canadian internment, and the relationship between the Kulturbund and the Breakaway Club 43, which Schwarz dismisses as a conversation club. At approximately the same time as Schwarz and Beer were being interviewed, in 1989, members of the London Research Group were conducting similar interviews, which formed the basis of an oral history project published in 2002 entitled Changing Countries. It is indisputable that the europäische ideen interviews would have had more impact if they'd appeared nearer the time of recording. For by 2020, when these interviews were published, some of the topics that had been, some of the topics they contained had been explored in more detail. The Pioneer Corps, for example, was a subject of a study which appeared in 2007, and internment in Canada was covered in a volume on internment published in 2017. Yet it is possible to infer that Peter Wayne's decision to share his internment experiences, a course he had been reluctant to take when the London Research Group project was underway, it's possible to infer that this decision had been influenced by regular visits from Nico Rollman in the final years of his life. And it was Nico Rollman's encouragement that had led Peter Wayne to contribute a more extensive interview to the Imperial War Museum's project, Civilian Internment in Britain, in 2008. Detained in the early days of internment, when the authorities were not separating refugees from expatriates, some of whom were Nazis, Wayne had had harrowing experience, which he was understandably reluctant to discuss. In this interview in Europäische Ideen, conducted somewhat later than the previous ones, amalgamation of conversations held in 1995 and 2016, Wayne remains reticent about Huyton, the first stage of his internment, commenting merely, dort saßen wir zusammen mit deutschen Nazis, but subsequently declaring that the crossing to Canada was traumatic, the commandant unsympathetic, and the sleeping conditions on the ship dreadful, before going on to describe his time in the Pioneer Corps in some detail. At this stage, I imagine some of my audience may be tearing their hair out and metaphorically shouting at the radio, inquiring, what about Erich Fried? When are you going to mention Erich Fried in detail? Yes, indeed. What about Erich Fried? And why have I mentioned him only briefly up till now? Indubitably, Fried fits into the category that interested Andreas. Exiled German-speaking authors living in England. Exiled German-speaking authors living in England. A former communist, moreover, who remained socially critical without offering allegiance to any political party, but inscribed himself as an anarchist, Fried never returned to his native Austria, anchored in London, as he remarked in an interview published in 1986 by his family. This was no exaggeration. A private life involving 3 marriages, 2 divorces, and 6 children constituted a fairly weighty encumbrance. Such were his ties to London, though, that although he died in Germany in 1988, he's buried in Kensal Green Cemetery. Yet there was one crucial difference between Fried's experience of exile and those authors already mentioned. He was a writer whose commercial success enabled him to give up his day job at the BBC German service in 1968 and live from his writings, becoming a celebrity in the German-speaking world. He did not, therefore, need the kind of support with publicity and publication opportunities that Andreas could offer. However, such was his importance that he could not be ignored. I've already mentioned the commemorative issue of his 65th birthday. Oh yes, and in 1986, 2 years before his death, a commemorative issue on the occasion of his 65th birthday was produced. The interview with Fried, already mentioned, offers a retrospective of his 65 years, but also considers his plans for the future and his attitude to death, a death foreshadowed in his poem Ende einer Emigration, printed here, which had been circulated to other emigres for comment and analysis, 4 of which were printed in this issue. Ingeborg Trewitz wrote, for example, Erich Frieds Gedicht registriert karg, fast nüchtern, die Tragödie der Flüchtlingsgespräche der 80er Jahre, der 60er, der 50er Jahre schon. Eine bittere Bilanz für uns alle. At the time of his death, of Andreas's death, Andreas was preparing a further issue to mark the centenary of Fried's birth, and this project was continued by his Berlin-based collaborator Nico Rollman and appeared in 2021 as issue number 159, including, as it does, a pamphlet published during the war years and a report of a visit of this enfant terrible poet to the highly conservative German school in London in March 1988. This issue spans the periods of Fried's life as a writer, with the emphasis on his political position. They Fight in the Dark, originally published in English by Young Austria in 1944, appears here in German for the first time. Dedicated to Rosa Hoffmann, a young resistance worker executed in March 1943, the work features the activities of a youthful opposition cell in Vienna. It has to be said, though, that in line with the position taken by the Austrian Centre at the time, the tone of the pamphlet constitutes an optimistic overassessment of the degree of popular resistance to the Anschluss, as Nico Rollman remarks in his introduction. This issue concludes with a report of the obstacles which had to be overcome before the authorities of the German school in Richmond could agree to invite this controversial poet to speak to the students, and features a short interview by the students with the poet in his home a few months later, in which Fried outlines his position as an anarchist who looks forward to the abolition of the nation state. When attempting to evaluate Andreas Mytze's contribution to exile literature and exile studies in Great Britain, it is necessary to go back to a time before the subject became the focus of academic study. Jeremy Adler, the son of H.G. Adler, commented, Andreas was an angel of the exiles. He felt profound compassion for their fate and took it upon himself to ease their lot. He had a large circle which he visited. He combined his roles of bookseller, editor, and friend in a seamless manner so that these neglected souls felt their lives truly mattered. This was long before the birth of the Exile Studies Group, which met at the Institute of Germanic Studies, and before Hamish Rich's conference in Aberdeen. At a time when an academic study of the subject was in its infancy, Andreas offered support to academics, offering them opportunity to publish their research when few other such possibilities existed. His research on Sommer is complemented by that on Olden and Fritz Gross, undertaken by members of this research centre, and helped to plug gaps in our knowledge. Moreover, his journal, Europäische Ideen, in subsequent years, continued to offer a treasure trove of glosses, biographical and bibliographical information for scholars and the general reader alike, seeking to enrich their knowledge of exile literature. Andreas could therefore be considered as a founding figure of British exile studies, wrote Professor Jeremy Adler, and that, I think, is a sentiment with which we can all concur. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Jennifer. You always manage to come up with a topic that is really original. So, are there any questions, please?
I think I've blinded everyone with science because I was sort of rushing through bibliographical details. I'm just thinking if there's something I can add. Oh, here's the Erich Fried 65, yeah. Yes, I mean, there were all, there's a lot that I've left out. There's lots of, I think one of the difficulties of writing about this is that these journals are very eclectic. You will find a little treasure, you know, sort of concealed in their pages, somebody's letter that was written to. I think at least the ones since he moved to London and was publishing them from London in the 80s, they are in the British Museum, so they will not be lost. But I'm not sure that a full run of them exists or is held by anybody. So, yes.
When did it finish? Did you say, before you said, but is it still, when did the finish?
It finished in 2021.
When died?
No, the last one, there was one, this Londoner Gespräch was the last one before he died. And then the Erich Fried centenary one was issued posthumously. And I think there are plans for a final one, which will be a tribute to Andreas. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Your title also included the word publicist. I would like to have your view or your answer. Did Mytze interfere in what was submitted to him? What was the sort of give and take between author and publisher? Be quite interested what his influence was intellectually.
Yes.
Or was it just a sort of printer, which I don't think?
No, it wasn't. No, I mean, he would, I mean, this was an aspect, obviously, which I didn't bring out. In some cases, he would commission things. You know, for the centenary editions, or the commemorative editions, he would write to people and ask for a contribution.
So where are the letters?
Well, they're in his. Yeah, I should have said that. The archive has now gone to Frankfurt, Deutsche Exilsammlung. What was I? I was going to say something else, but it's gone out of my head now. I'm sorry.
If you come to
no. Well, in terms of the books, I think in terms of the difficulty is that some things were republished, even literary texts like Die Gaskammer were republished in the journal. And some were republished as books or anthologized. I think generally speaking, well, I did give you an example. I gave you an example of the compilation of the Theresienstadt poems by Adler, where Andreas selected some. And this selection did not meet with the approval of the author, and then the author died, so the issue did not eventuate. But that, I think, was a book. That was
So
in.
there was a correspondence between authors and.
Sorry, say again.
There was a correspondence between authors and publisher, and.
Well, I think with Adler, it was mainly. Done by word of mouth, but his son Jeremy reported that.
No, I wanted about Mytze. I mean, did he? You said he commissioned.
Yes.
That's fine. But if somebody came to him and said, "Would you like to publish my poem?" Was there a sort of? Was he interested in everything, or what did he?
Well, I really can't.
Not like, and what did he?
As I said at the beginning, this is a preliminary assessment. There is an extensive correspondence with Brehm while he was compiling this anthology here, But that has now gone to Frankfurt, and I don't have any details that I can tell you. Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I think there is enough evidence to show, to answer your question. And most of it's gone to Frankfurt now.
What about the poems from Theresienstadt? I mean, is there any possibility now of publishing them?
Well, I don't know. You'd have to ask Jeremy Adler. I think they actually physically are in King's College. That's where Adler's papers have gone. I would. Oh, have they? Oh.
They've gone to where, sorry?
I think they've also gone to Frankfurt.
Oh, they've
moved from Kings.
Oh, that's sad, isn't
All
it?
those things, there were several archives that chair members looking after, and you took.
Yes, yeah. No, I mean, it would be wonderful if they could be published, but it looks like not. You know, I mean, publishing poems is a bit of a luxury. I don't know if Nick wants to say anything. He's sitting there quietly. Yeah. I mean, I do have I have seen a little postcard from Jeremy to Mytze saying, you know, Mrs. So-and-so has got her husband's poems, and she'd terribly, her late husband's poems, she'd be terribly grateful if you would publish them, but I don't think he did. And in fact, he was not very active in book publishing after about 1980, I think, wasn't it, Jane? When, yeah. So,
How did it work out financially?
I don't think you ought to ask that question. He never bought a property, and he never married. And he didn't, as far as we know, he didn't have any children. So he lived sort of a simple life, almost a monastic life, you could say. He got a lot of income, yes. I mean, these things, I mean, I haven't told you about the GDR ones, of course, you know, that's another, but the ones he did about GDR authors, he had orders for 100 copies, you know, for one person. So he sold quite a few of these. So he managed to get enough money for his everyday needs, let's put it that way. Yeah. But he obviously didn't make a fortune. He also did some trading in autographs and paintings and that sort of thing. And I mean, there are we've seen some invoices that are quite a lot of money, but who's to know, you know, you need to be an economist to know how much money that was worth at the time, how much that was worth at the time, yeah.
It sounds as though that was his vocation.
It was his vocation. I mean, yes. And I mean, considering that he did all of this, unfortunately, I mean, he didn't do anybody any favors by calling his publishing house and his journal, giving it the same title. It's confusing. But as far as the europäische ideen books, what you call a book, are concerned, I've not found a complete list. I just take it from adverts. And I've got a list of the remainders. But so I wouldn't be able to tell you how many books in total he published.
It looks as though he's worked very hard at these.
Oh, it's unbelievable. I mean,
Tremendous amount of work.
The networking involved. You know, when I was writing this, I thought, well, you're not telling people about the net, but you can't do everything in one talk. I think there's sufficient evidence now of the correspondence. Most of it's gone to Frankfurt, and I hope they don't throw too much away. and
Yeah.
and there are folders about the planning of these europäische ideen and the, you know, and we have the what do you call it, the circulation lists from. So, you know, I'm just hoping that someone else will perhaps go to Frankfurt and look at this stuff. And
The circulation list would be interesting to look at. wouldn't it?
yeah. And I mean, he wrote to, this is not with reference to exile in Great Britain, but the GDR stuff, he was writing to everybody, even Marcus Wolf. You know, I haven't seen any letters to the Queen, but you know, practically everybody else he would write to, yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Yes,
It is amazing.
we just have to hope that this becomes his, you know, his legacy, shall we say? These the journals, but in.
May I raise a second question?
Sorry.
Of course.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned Club 43.
Sorry, mentioned who?
Club 43.
Oh, Club 43, yes, yeah.
Did I hear correctly that he was not very complimentary about Club?
No, that was Schwartz. That was Egon Schwartz,
Okay.
a Kulturbund member. Yes, yeah.
Do we know why?
Well, for political reasons. You mean Schwartz? Well, Schwartz was a member of the Kulturbund.
Yes. So there are many people in the Club 43.
Right. Well, okay. You probably know better than I do on that matter then. It's generally described as having seceded.
There have been some intellectual, also quality question of
Yeah, yeah.
So that hostility did remain, even though there was some interchange between the two. I think that's the answer.
Yeah, yes. Yes, even though they did have joint.
Well, the Kulturbund was thought to be too communist inclined by some of its members, and so they broke away and formed this group, F43. And there was a hostility remaining from the Kulturbund towards Club 43, even though none of the Kulturbund did speak to them.
Yes, they had joint. They had joint events, didn't they? Yeah, yeah.
So that's-
And Kulturbund, forward is a Club 43 event 50 years. So, can't be that way.
Yes, well, I mean, it's funny. Andreas knew about Club 43, but I'm not sure how often he went there. I mean, and it's the other strange thing. I mean, we knew about Andreas because Char, as I said, and Marion Mallet, who's not here tonight, collaborated with him, you know, on a publication, but he didn't actually seem to mix in academic circles. And for example, Ian Wallace, who died a couple of years ago, you know, we assumed that they should know each other, but Wallace's widow has not found any record of any interaction with Andreas, which I find difficult to believe. But anyway, you know, it doesn't mean to say it didn't. But you know, he didn't seem. I mean, did he, Nick? Whenever we've been to Club 43, he didn't seem to be there.
No, never.
No, never. No.
It does actually not.
No. So he was you know, he did keep himself out of well, I would Club 43, but you know, he was on to a certain extent he was on the sidelines.
Yes.
Although, you know, in terms of writing and publication, he wasn't.
I don't know if you made special mention of Andreas's book on Potfeld.
Yes.
You did mention it.
I did, yes.
1977.
Yes.
And self-published by europäische ideen.
Yes.
And very dense, unfortunately, rather dense. typographed as well.
Oh
But
dear,
it's an amazing book. It should really be properly republished.
yeah.
Yes.
Mm.
There was a letter about Publicist.
Well, that's right, yes. I mean, he didn't publish much. I think it's the only book by himself he published.
Yes.
Yes. And he did anthologize Ottvart's, some work of Ottvart's, which I didn't mention because I thought, you know, you can only say so much, but there was an, I can't remember what it was called.
Dedicated to Alfred Kantorowicz.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yes, he was another one of Andreas's
Yes.
authors. Yeah.
Amazing.
It was actually Gerhard Hirschberg
Oh,
who
yes.
said that Marion Mytze, Andreas Mytze, we had that correspondence between the two Olden brothers.
Oh, yes.
It was vague, didn't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
And went to Hirschberg and said, contact Andreas Mytze, and he immediately accepted it.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, Hirschfeld from the German Historical Institute. Yeah. Yeah, the editor of that book, isn't it, called Exile in Großbritannien. Yeah. Yeah.
Monia,
Can I ask a naughty question about Ernst Sommer, because I haven't heard of it before, and I've seen that you've written an article about it, so I'll read that tomorrow. But was Die Gaskammer translated into English, do you know, during the war?
Do you know, Jane?
No, it was a feeble attempt by German to translate it, but no, none of these were translated into English.
I don't think it was. No.
I was just also looking, Revolte der Heiligen was translated in 1946.
Yeah.
Did you go to the special collections of Reading and see the
Did I see one?
I've just found out that they've got readers' reports in the special collections at Reading University on that, so I'm really interested to read that. I'm really
No.
And that was done in Mexico.
Yeah,
wasn't it?
that's right. That's
A
what it
very
said.
rough and ready translation of it.
Okay. Well,
So was it? Yeah.
Revolt of the Heiligen.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
it needs to be retranslated, I suppose. Well,
Yeah.
anyone can be bothered.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, well, no, I'm sorry, I'm not up on the translations of Ernst Sommer. I mean, there were quite a few of his works republished in the GDR in the early post-war years. He's
Practically nothing was translated into English. And there might be one or two Czech versions, but.
the Templar wasn't it? And then,
But Andreas was trying to get books into various libraries and, one of his missions in life.
thank you, I'll follow up.
are there any more questions at all, or comments, observations?
You can also comment what of the correspondence, the later correspondence Andreas had with people was on by fax machine with the fading paper. So it might have been some interesting things.
oh yes, have been thrown away. Yes, that's true. Yes, yes, on the cutting room floor.
Yeah. Who knows how many emails will be saved in the
Yes.
future. No. Well, in that case, it remains for me to thank you again, Jennifer. And I think there's a lot of looking up to do here. I'd like to mention before we finish the next seminar, which will be on the 12th of April. And I apologize for the pronunciation. Gilcuddy. I hope it's near enough to her name. She'll be speaking about books on the Holocaust, but for children rather than adults. So it's a totally different aspect. And I think it will be very interesting to hear what she has found and the whole approach to such books for children, especially given the government policy of Holocaust studies in schools nowadays. So thank you all very much for braving the weather, the trains,
Well, trains
and the
are all
return
right.
journey. No, they're not. I had difficulty getting here. and wish you a safe journey and hope to see you again next time. Thank you very much.